Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us this evening. I feel much privilege and honour to have been asked to open a seminar which has been jointly organised by the SOAS Student Union, ISOC and SEMS. SOAS has a proud tradition to develop, nurture and cultivate discussion. Tonight's event, I believe, will be a memorable one because it sincerely aims to achieve this in abundance. My name is Sham Kayoum. I am the Director of the Centre for Ethnic Minority Studies, SEMS, which is in the School of Law. The principal aim of our centre is to undertake, disseminate and share research and best practice in relation to ethnic minority legal studies. Our work, in essence, revolves around the fundamental issue of understanding the other, a lack of which can quickly spiral into fear and hostility. We are ethnic. We are all ethnic. We may not recognize it, but whether we are minorities or part of the majority depends on the context. We live in an age of unparalleled diversity. Thus, the need to understand the other has never been so pressing. Only by understanding the other and oneself can we work towards living better together, make better decisions, whether in relation to law, policy, or at the grassroots level. One can say so much about the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Indeed, our esteemed experts shall. However, if I may, I wish to share a few thoughts with you from a personal perspective. As a young man searching for knowledge, trying to understand the world, I came across the autobiography of Malcolm X. I purchased the book from a small stall immediately as my eyes saw the cover. As I read the book, two major thoughts grew inside me and have remained ever since. They became part of my life's bundle of experiences. The first is in relation to the time that Malcolm X spent in prison. There, he attempted to read a book, but he realized that there were so many words he simply did not understand. Here was a man who recognized he was ignorant of and to the world. He wanted to change. He wanted the world to change. So he obtained a dictionary, wrote out every entry, learning the meaning of each word before moving on to the next. He would read all day, and when the call for lights out came each night, he would continue to read with the help of a corridor light. Diligently, meticulously, he continued his education until he had finished the whole dictionary. From then on, Malcolm X read and read and read. The ability to articulate your thoughts with clarity and purpose, the ability to read and comprehend and then share, such abilities are the lifeblood of the one who wishes to have a voice, the right to agency and self-determination, to the one who wishes to change the world. If I may, in Malcolm X's words, education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. The other thought that I would like to share with you is Al-Haji Malik al-Shabazz knew that his life was in danger. He had received several death threats, yet he refused to change his beliefs, his conviction. In his words, if we don't stand for something, we may fall for anything. I have the great pleasure and privilege to pass the floor now to two of my students who have worked so hard, tirelessly and meticulously. It was their vision to have tonight's event. To them, on behalf of SOAS, I am indebted. I would like you to please welcome Abdul Wahid Muhammad and Marianne.
Wow. Wow. Did you guys see the line outside? It's huge. You guys were the lucky ones who made it in. Wow. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome you, all of you guys, here tonight, in the name of the SOAS Islamic Society, SOAS Students' Union, and also SEMS, the Centre of Ethnic Minority Studies. Would like to thank you again for being here with us tonight on a Tuesday night at 7:30, 7:35 now, I think. But yeah, you know, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So, you know, I would like to really thank you. And also, we'll just another note. This will be streamed also to Harlem, New York, the Dr. Betty Shabazz and Malcolm X Center in New York, Harlem. So I'd like to welcome and thank our international audience for tuning in as well. But now we'll pass the floor to Mariam.
Okay, hi, welcome everyone. 47 years ago, on the 21st of February 1965, a great man, Malcolm X, was assassinated. For many of us who have read his powerful autobiography, who have heard his speeches, followed his struggles and his personal evolution regarding Islam, regarding politics, we have always been astonished and wondered why is he not giving enough recognition, international recognition and recognition in general. So we wanted to look at this more deeply and for what he was fighting for. And so often we have been comparing him to other speakers or other famous African American who have been fighting for the same, have been struggling for the same things, but we usually comparing him as violent vs non-violent, etc. So we think we need to give him a lot more recognition for his work.
So, acknowledging these things, a group of SOAS students, together with the Islamic Society, decided to do something about this. You know, we decided to show the legacy of Malcolm X in a positive light. You know. To unmask a lot of the old kind of perceptions of Malcolm X and to show him in the light which he wanted to be showed and which he deserves to be showed in. I mean, so from our initiative, SOAS Students' Union and SOAS ISOC, you know, we contacted the Dr. Betty Shabazz Center in New York, in Harlem, and they were more than happy and willing to join in this project and to be partners with us in this project because they too had the same vision.
Okay, so our first speaker tonight, he is the first holder of the Anthony Giddens Professorship in Social Theory in LSE. His intellectual background is multidisciplinary and he has extensive interests in literature, art, music, and cultural history, as well as in social science. He is best known for his work on racism, nationalism, and ethnicity, and his original approach to the history of the African diaspora in the Western Hemisphere. Please welcome Paul Gilroy.
And our second speaker is a professor of contemporary Islamic studies at Oxford University, Oriental Institute at St. Anthony's College. He also teaches at the Oxford Faculty of Theology. He's a visiting professor at the Faculty of Islamic Studies in Qatar and the Mondiapolis University in Morocco, and a senior research fellow at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. He holds an MA in philosophy and French literature and a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Geneva. In Cairo, Egypt, he received one-on-one intensive training in classical Islamic scholarship from Al-Azhar University scholars. Through his writings and lectures, he has contributed to debate on issues of Muslims in the West and Islamic revival in the Muslim world. He's active in the field of academia and also at the grassroots level, lecturing extensively throughout the world on theology, ethics, social justice, ecology, and interfaith as a well intercultural dialogue. He is president of the European think tank. You guys are. I thought you guys laughing at me. Wow. Did you? So, without any more further ado, please welcome Professor Tariq Ramadan.
Our third speaker, an advocate for his Northern Manhattan community for nearly 15 years and served in leaders and led various nonprofit boards, including the chair of the board of the Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center and the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance, an umbrella organization for artists and art groups. Zead is currently the president of the board of the directors of the New York chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, New York. He also serves on the board of directors for the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone and has been a member of this community board. Sorry. Please welcome Zead Ramadan.
And so without any further ado, we'd like to welcome our host for the night and chair Zead Ramadan.
Thank you, Abdurrahim, and thank you, Sister Maryam. I can't say enough for what they've done in putting this event together. I want to thank SOAS, and I want to thank all of you for being here. There's, I believe, over 600 people here today, and I can't thank you enough for your commitment to honoring the legacy of Malcolm X by coming here and trying to learn. So I just want to give you a round of applause. Now, I did tell them to put my bio first because being surrounded by scholars like these makes me look very, very minuscule. But I'm the chair of the board of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Education Center. It's actually in the Audubon Ballroom building space where Malcolm X was assassinated. It's been renovated, and it's actually a beautiful space now. Our mission is to enhance and protect the great legacy of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz. And mainly we do this in three ways. By protecting their legacies in their work in human rights, because Malcolm was very much more interested in human rights than he was in civil rights. But we also protect their legacies in their work in civil rights, and especially education. I think Brother Sham actually talked about how Malcolm was dedicated to education, knowing that that's how he was going to understand the world better and work for his causes in a better way. And I think Dr. Betty Shabazz, she has the famous quote, education is not a privilege, it's a right. And so we honor these people at our center, and we protect their legacies. In fact, we have an exhibition, a nationally renowned exhibition. It's been traveling around the United States, and its last stop is at the Shabazz Center. It's going on right now through the end of April. It's called Freedom's Sisters. And, ladies and gentlemen, there are missing pages in our history books. The missing pages are those of women who also have struggled and given their lives for the sake of freedom so we can all live more comfortably, especially women of color. So Freedom Sisters celebrates 20 African American women who struggled and who changed the course of America and changed the course of history. Many times we know people like Harriet Tubman. We've studied maybe Harriet Tubman or Rosa Parks and their impact, but we haven't studied women such as Ida B. Wells Barnett. We haven't studied Ella Jo Baker, a woman who helped form the NAACP. She was one of the leaders who helped start the NAACP. And it's funny, I had said this the other day, Ella Jo Baker helped connect the dots to African American organizations around the United States to try to have them under one umbrella. Malcolm X was trying to do something similar with the Organization of African American Unity. Decades later, she inspired him. And while Harriet Tubman was running through streams and looking up at stars and holding out her hand and saying, "Come to freedom," and was never caught, and bringing many, many people to freedom up to the north, she wasn't waiting for Frederick Douglass to craft eloquent words on paper. She was struggling for those freedoms. It was independent, and they need to be honored, and that's what we have at the center. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to having a lively discussion with two distinguished scholars, and we're going to get underway. So here we are. The first question we'd like to ask Professor Gilroy. What would Malcolm think of President Obama's ascension to presidency and his performance in a post-racial discourse and the silly but widespread claim that America has transcended its tragic racial past? So the question is, How do we talk about Malcolm X in the age of Obama? Professor?
Well, there is no age of Obama.
Let me amend the agenda. They are first supposed to speak for 10 minutes each to start with an introduction, so I apologize for that skipping a couple. Professor Gilroy.
Should I go up there and do it, or can I do it from here? What do you want me to do? I'll stay here. We'll do it from here. Okay. Well, thanks again. I repeat the thanks that have already been offered. 47 years we meet now to remember Malcolm, to recover Malcolm, although Malcolm's with us. And I want to liken Malcolm initially in my commemoration of his influence, his enduring influence, to the figure of Fanon, Frantz Fanon, someone else. You know, last year we commemorated Fanon and thought of him 50 years after the publication of his final book, The Wretched of the Earth. And like Fanon, I think, a descendant of slaves who made an intellectual journey that enabled him to connect the freedom struggles and hopes and aspirations of post-slave populations, black populations of the Atlantic rim, the Atlantic world, with the struggle for liberation and decolonization that was developing in the 20th century. So I liken those two figures. They are similar to me. Both of them ask us to focus on them as our contemporaries. They are our contemporaries. And by being our contemporaries, they ask us to think about the boundaries of our contemporary experience. What is contemporary to us? It's very easy to engage this and say 47 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. We get in a world which lacks history, we imagine that 47 years or 50 years is a long time. We think it's the past. It's not. The past is not past. And our intimacy, our familiarity with their thinking, with their imaginations, in a moment where the crisis of imagination confounds us from every direction, we experience them as our contemporaries. And that is, for me, their power. Their power as travelers, as revolutionaries in a situation where our situation here, at least in the overdeveloped parts of the planet, we lose our sense of an intimate relationship with revolution, and they restore it to us. These, of course, are figures too for whom the prospect of linking the freedom struggles of Atlantic peoples with decolonization and national liberation struggles elsewhere exacted a heavy price in the form of mysterious and unexplained death in which governments were implicated. And we should remember, too, that the price of that linkage has always been, historically, a very high one. As has already been pointed out, let me emphasize, I agree with the notion of Malcolm as a human rights activist. Fanon, too, a focus on the human, a new humanism, not the humanism of the Cold War, not the humanism of the liberals, but a humanism that's configured, adapted by its opposition to racial orders and hierarchies and inequalities wherever they could be found. And I think in the moment when the language, the discourse, the poetry of human rights is cheapened and polluted in the mouths that think that sending a drone over here or merging military and development objectives as somehow a humanitarian project, we need to restore the value, the incendiary power of that idea of the human. And these figures help us to do that too. But someone said, I don't know if it was you, perhaps it was you, Zead, earlier on, talked about the poverty of history. You know, we need a history of Malcolm. And I think here one must be a little bit critical of the cult of Malcolm, because we need a history. We need a better history than we have. We don't really need the myth of Malcolm as some sort of deity, some pure figure to be venerated. Respected, yes. To be venerated, no. I think we need a better history. And I think that our acquisition of that history has sometimes been blocked by the custodians of Malcolm as myth, who would also, I think, be people who might imagine themselves to be custodian of the forms of intellectual property that are bound up with Malcolm. Let me say this, I don't think history is property. I don't think history should be property. It doesn't belong to anybody. We use it. It forms us, but it's never our property. Malcolm should not be our property. We shouldn't let him be a myth of that kind. Well, he's also, of course, a world figure, a world historic figure. For a time, the most famous black man on earth, there, following in the trajectory of the athletes, the Joe Louis, the Jesse Owens, these figures. And he's someone who, I suppose, is a world historic figure because beyond the borders of that US homeland from which he was so comprehensively estranged, Malcolm speaks out to a wider world constituency. His public, his readers are partly created and sometimes reached via the new communications media that characterized the Cold War period. He's a television operator. He's comfortable in that world, and perhaps that too helps to make him our contemporary. He likes the game of sound bites. He's the king. I said he wasn't a deity. He's the king. He's the king of sound bites, and that makes him our contemporary also. So those flickering pictures, black and white pictures of police dogs and protests, of fire hoses and flames, conducted from the transformation of the United States, go out worldwide. And that Cold War environment fosters Malcolm's moral commitment. It feeds his vision of human relationships from which the corrosive power of racism has been absolutely removed. And his is one of many voices raised to demand that the West acknowledge the damage that has been done to its democracies, its civilizations, by the twin evils of race consciousness and race hierarchy. And we feel Malcolm being transformed by his growing contact with that outside world, by his travel experiences, by, if you will forgive me, I don't know the right word for this, but we could call it maybe Hajj cosmopolitanism. It's the cosmopolitanism of the Hajj, that moment that detonates his nationalism and propels him into a different space, a transnational space. So Malcolm's our contemporary for that reason too. Now, he's a symbol, above all, of where the United States might think about rejoining the world. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, often we are invited to think of the United States, here in Europe anyway, as our future. Certainly the people who rule us have a telos. They see it like that. We are behind them and they're ahead of us. We have to catch up, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years. But that's the scheme, the analytical or interpretive scheme that they offer us. And I think I don't see it that way, and we shouldn't see it that way. And Malcolm didn't see it that way because he belongs in a tradition of thinking which says that racial orders are primitive things that have to be disposed of on the way to a human democracy, on the way to a new and authentic democratic human possibility which has not yet been known, but which is radically incompatible with racial orders of all kinds. A couple more points, because I know I'm running out of my time now. I think other things that I want to put on the table for our discussion would be the image of Malcolm, not only as a prisoner who transforms himself through the power of his own will, but Malcolm as a pious person, an ascetic person, someone who withdraws, someone who doesn't seem to be vain. I was always struck by a passage. I meant to bring it with me. I didn't remember because I went to teach this morning. I didn't remember to pick it up. A passage from an essay about Malcolm written by June Jordan, the famous African-American poet and essayist, distinguished voice who we also perhaps should mourn tonight, not least, of course, for her commitment and tenacious linkage of the struggles of African Americans and their freedom aspirations with those of the Palestinian people through her poetry, above all. And June Jordan spoke about Malcolm and had a chance to observe him when she was a student at Barnard in the 60s there in Harlem, and she said that he had a threadbare suit, that he was a humble person, he wasn't vain, she said. The humility and the lack of vanity, the lack of ostentation, these were qualities that were registered in her mind in her exposure to Malcolm. And I would like to say that quality of asceticism in a world where everyone's, well, perhaps not so much now, living large and bigging themselves up, that this quality of humility and piety is an important one that we learn through Malcolm's figure, a sort of righteous quality. Lastly, I think, I don't know about you, but often when we involve ourselves in the struggle against racial orders, in the struggle against racism and racial hierarchy, we don't really like to operate. We don't really like to operate a view of that process which allows for change. You know, sometimes we fall into the problem that Fanon identified, whereby we want a black and white world. You know, we want to take racism out of it, but we leave it in that form. And it seems to me that one thing that Malcolm's life and writing and the power of both of them communicate to us is the possibility of change, the symbol of change and growth. And it's linked, I think, by what I want to call the maturity of his perspective, one which not only is committed absolutely to the tireless human capacity to be able to alter oneself in the world more than one likes to imagine one can do, but also, I think, to be able to acknowledge not just the damage which is done to us by those powers, done to us by those governments, done to us by those armies and those assassins, but alongside that damage, to acknowledge the damage that we do to ourselves and to each other. And it seems to me bound up in Malcolm's life, in Malcolm's example, not as a mythic figure, but as a historical figure, is that acknowledgement. And that, for me, must be the starting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gilroy. Professor Tariq Ramadan.
Thank you. First, thank you for this invitation here. I really want to thank the organizers and all what they have been doing over the last few months and weeks to make it possible. I think it's great and it's very good. And I want to thank you for coming all the way from New York to be with us and just helping it also to happen. What you said really, Professor Gilroy, is so many things that I think are so important. I don't want to repeat them, but maybe to start with 3 main points as a kind of introduction to the discussion. Very often when you travel to the States or around the world, when it comes to speak about the figures, of course, and I completely agree with the fact that we have to be very cautious to understand the message and not to idealize the man. And this is a very important point, which if we understand the last 2 years of his life, we understand why we should avoid that. Mm-hmm. That it's all a question of a message, it's not a question of idealizing someone. And this is also what happened with him in '63 when he realized that Elijah Muhammad was wrong and the message was wrong as to the substance of it, not only just because he was lying, but the message, the fact that he was idealizing someone was the wrong way. So we should not do with him what he realized at the end, that this was the wrong way to live with it. But there is something here which is, as to the message, very often we speak about Dr. King and saying this is the peaceful message. And first, that's not exactly right. It was not only a peaceful message. At very important points, Dr. King was very clear that we have to stand up. Now, the point is that with Malcolm X, there is something which is a non-violent message, but a radical one. He was radical. Radical in the right meaning, not in the right sense, not in preaching violence. He was not preaching violence, but he was saying, we are not going to let it go. We are not accepting what you are doing. And while he was talking, and this is something that he had till the end, and this is why I really want us to reassess the very meaning of radical. When people are saying, oh, be careful, radicalization and violence. No, radical means also that he was always saying something which is important. Yes, we have to speak about human rights, but there is no point speaking about human rights if we don't speak about power. If we don't connect human rights with power, who is deciding and what is decided? So blackness and whiteness in the States at that time was connected with power and was connected to the human rights, and saying at the very beginning, from the very beginning, that when it comes to, yes, we have to speak about love, but we have to speak about justice. And you can't speak about justice if you don't speak about power. So this was all, this connection, and even in the way he was talking about it, was very important. Someone who was day in, day out, when he was talking after even he left the Nation of Islam, saying, I'm a Negro. Saying to the people, I'm going to use the word that you are using because your violence is deeper, it's more damageable, it's more destructive than our resistance. So you are violent, we are resisting, and our resistance is radical. We are not going to let you do what you want to do with us. So I think that the very beginning here is, you can also, by the way, you can also speak about love in a radical way, which is the good way to speak about love, in the radical way. But my point here is just to understand the terminology, the way he was talking about this, and the way he was connecting all this with power, justice, love, spirituality. This is something which is important. And at the end of the day, also talking about who is responsible, so in which way we have to face this. Having said that now as the starting point, when it comes to the way he is presented and sometimes neglected and sometimes idealized in the wrong way, let me just highlight three main areas when it comes to understand Malcolm X's legacy, it's important. The first is, of course, racism. And racism was important by saying you can't understand the United States of America if you don't deal with racism. It is part of American history. And you can't. And not only he was saying this, he was talking about the structural racism, he was talking about racism at the highest level of the society, and he was talking about racism at the grassroots level with the people. But he was not only talking about this. If you read what he said even about Muslims, he was very critical towards the Arabs. He said, you are racist. You came to our country and you are only interested in who is converting to Islam among the white people. Because in fact, once again, among the Arabs who happen to be Muslims, you are interested by power. And the power is with the whites. So a white convert is better in your mind than a black convert. And we have to face it today. This is why he is so connected to what is happening now in the United States of America, and by the way, even here, even in Europe, even in Africa. The relationship between the Muslims saying that our message is universal, all brothers and sisters in Islam, depending on your color. But this is what he was saying. He was saying it from the very beginning. So racism is transversal. It's touching, it's crossing all the boards. It's within Islam, and this was also something that. So he was on that with this discussion. Someone who was touching on all these dimensions, the racism and structural racism. It's something which is important, and this is why. And this is the second point. There is something which is quite interesting in his message, is the connections between all the issues. So, and this is also what he realized when he, by the way, he was already like this before he went to the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage had an impact on him, and then he started to understand we have to connect the African resistance, the African liberation, with the Afro-American liberation within. Mm-hmm. But not only this, he had the intuition at that time that what is happening in the Middle East, and Zionism, is also connected with the same liberation. So it might be that he was facing, and this is why he was so much demonized at one point, that he was connecting. You want to speak about Africa? You have to speak about African-American racism. And if you want to speak about the Middle East and the relationship with Africa, you also have to speak about the Middle East and the relationship with Israel and Zionism as a movement. He said it, he wrote it, and this is why also he was criticized very deeply from within the American establishment. So this is something which is, once again, important. And then he added to this the Islamic dimension. The universality of Islam for him was, after he went to the pilgrimage, to understand that we are all brothers in humanity, so we have to connect, and we have brothers and sisters in Islam, and we have to connect. So it's a comprehensive approach by saying, in fact, at the end of the day, all this is connected through power, and sometimes these are the same people. And these are the last intuition that he had during in the last talks. It's all connected. We are facing the same people. I think that this comprehensive approach is part of his own evolution, because at the end of the day, he passed away, he was young. He was young. And we have to take this into account. 39 years, it's very young, and he was evolving. And mainly the last 2 years were critical and very important. Let me just add a last point, which you raised at the end of your talk, which has to do with something that even in the movie that you saw you watched maybe the movie on Malcolm X, it's talking about his evolution. I think that we really have to understand what happened with the pilgrimage, his traveling around the world and understanding that he was wrong. It's really a very deep spiritual experience here. And the first was not the pilgrimage itself. And this is why the word that you use, humility, was so important. He arrived in Saudi Arabia. He was completely neglected. The people didn't know who he was. Who is this guy? A black man in Saudi Arabia. It's already a problem. He was treated like this, and he was left on the side, not considered. And he was coming with all this, the people in the United States of America knowing Malcolm X, and he was nothing. He started the spiritual journey by being nothing in the sight of the people who were welcoming him. And then he started changing and understanding how Islam was, saying at the very essence of Tawheed was this. And this is where I think that we have to reassess the spiritual dimension of this conversion during the last 2 years. It's a conversion. Something happened, which was, we have to change. This is wrong. Our struggle is a struggle for justice, not only a struggle for black against white. It's a struggle. And then this dimension of him praying and him asking the meaning of things. I think from an Islamic viewpoint, it's important, but not only. He understood through his struggle that coming back to Islam was the best way for him to become universal. Understanding the right principles of Islam was the way for him to be universal. Not the way Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam was doing it as isolating the Muslims, exactly the opposite. The opposite was coming back to Islam and showing that these principles are helping the Muslims, but not only the Muslims, all the people who are resisting. Why? Because the very essence of Islam is, if you are a human being and you have human rights, so you have to struggle for justice and liberating yourself with all the people, by all means possible, meaning here to be radical without being violent, but to know and to have the whole picture. I think that these three dimensions are very important, and we need to understand that the last one is a very spiritual one. We are talking about asceticism and all this dimension of coming back to the heart. This is something which was very important with him, in the way he was humble, in the way he was very, very powerful, in the way he was talking, and very humble in the way he was dealing with people of knowledge, with people who were teaching him, with people who were directing and helping him to be on the right side. And this spiritual dimension is very often neglected. So I think we have to be very cautious not to be misled by the powers of his words and the in-depth of his faith. I think that this could be misleading in our assessment.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramadan. I think we have a lot of points of interest and a great foundation for a great discussion this evening. We're going to get right into the questions. And I guess some of you have already heard the first one. We'll repeat it again. We have a black president in America, President Obama. And people have started to talk about post-racial America, which sounds ludicrous, but I'd like to hear what Professor Gilroy thinks about that. And I also like to hear how Malcolm X is discussed in the age of Obama, his relevance.
Well, as I've already said, let me say it again. I thought it was a good place to start. There is no age of Obama. There may yet be the age of Malcolm. We haven't even got to that point. We don't know when the age of Malcolm will be. Perhaps that will be sooner than the age of Obama, because there is no age of Obama. Obama, you know, I mean, what can one say? He was against the war before. That was a good thing, I think. Would Malcolm be surprised that an African American can be a president? Yes, I imagine. We were all a little bit surprised about that. But there's something in the figure of Obama that helps us with this, which is to see how his journey as an individual through the rarefied atmosphere of the corporate multiculturalism that shaped him tells us, on one level, the meaninglessness of race, but it also tells us about the persistence of racism. And you can have both of those things at the same time. You can be delivered to a point where you see that race is nothing in the context of a politics which says that race is everything. So those two things have to fit together, and we have to see how they fit. So I'm not really interested in thinking about how the age of Obama speaks to this, because we can see that the belligerence and the corporate interests and the militarization of social life and the game of political institutions proceeds whoever is at the helm. I mean, you know, what do we think the president is? You know, the president is a kind of a puppet figure tossed around in the machinery of government, in the machinery of politics and economics. And so there's no shock in finding that an African American can inhabit that role, and you know, I'm sure he's a good person, you know, and he will do what he can do. But there's actually a sense in which Malcolm tunes us into a different frequency. He takes us somewhere else where we're not shocked or surprised, and we don't look to Obama to enact some sort of automatic solidarity with the freedom interests that brought about his presidency. We know that we will be betrayed. We still do it. I'm sure if there are any Americans here who are inclined to vote, they'll probably vote for Obama because the prospects will be worse, and that will be the end of it, you know. So I don't want to be mesmerized by Obama. I want to keep Obama in proportion, and I'm more interested in the age of Malcolm than I am in the age of Obama.
Professor Ramadan, after his religious consciousness in Islam, how was Malcolm X's life, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, and his political philosophy relevant to Muslims living in the West facing a rising tide of Islamophobia, the Arab Spring, and rising Islamist politics? And I have to tell you, folks, I hate the term Islamist. I mean, have you ever heard anybody say... heard somebody say a Jewist or a Christianist, and I think it's a poor word to use. Could Malcolm have served as a bridge between America and its understanding of Muslims around the world, and indeed in America?
Yes, I think that this is, once again, it's an important question, because you can see that what he said in the 60s and what we are experiencing now, there are many parallels and similarities, and we have to listen and maybe to think again about what he was saying. For example, you know, something which is the starting point of this discussion, about his understanding of Islam. When he wrote his last words before just being killed, he understood that he was going to be killed. And he said, now that I understand the true Islam. In fact, he understood something that many Muslims sometimes don't get. That when he started to come back to the very meaning of his religion and being open and to show that, yes, we are clear with our principles, we are proud of being Muslims. We are not going to give up. This is our religion. He was not aggressive. He started to have an articulated discourse about power and structure and reaching out. He understood that he was becoming more dangerous. In fact, you are not dangerous if you are self-isolating yourself. He understood that the message of Islam being universal, this is when it's going to be dangerous. And the point is that many, Western Muslims today, in the way they deal with the surrounding environment, they do exactly the opposite of what should be done. Instead of, reaching out, saying, we are not going to give up, this is our rights as human beings, as citizens, that we have to reach out. This was his perception from the very beginning. Adding to this, something which is very important for all of us, is the divisions within the Muslim communities and races and structural, there are Muslims, second-class Muslims among Muslims. And what I said before is exactly what he was experiencing. And you still have today in the United States of America two trends that are not joining, they are not talking. We were together a few months ago in Washington, or it was in Chicago. Once again, it's very difficult to have, the African-American Muslims. They have the perception that they are not considered as Muslims as the others. And the concerns and the perception, mainly we are talking about religion. He was talking about social dynamics. He was talking about justice. He was talking about civil rights, based on his understanding of what it means to be a human being. So these are very important dimensions when it comes to why today we can speak about a new type of racism against Muslims. Islamophobia is a new type of racism that are targeting the Muslim and saying it might be that all the discussion about radicalization is the threat. It might be that it's not exactly the truth. That confidence, citizenship, reaching out, speaking out, this is what is the threat. And he started to understand this at the end of his life. You asked something which is also important with the Muslim world and Arab Spring. It might be that, by the way, I don't use the concept of Arab Spring, even though I'm teaching Islamism sometimes. But the point is that I think that with his understanding that everything which is happening within the United States of America and what is happening in the Middle East, in fact, these are the same struggle. These are, and I think that this, we don't get it. Very often, some of the new European citizens, they think that to show how much they are Europeans, they have to show to their country and to forget about the international issues. That's completely wrong. That's a trap. So show me your citizenship by just being committed here and forget about injustices at the international level, races, in the way we are dealing with immigrants, for example. And this is something which was very important. I think that this understanding, this vision that he had, connecting all these dimensions, is something that we have to recapture, understand, and come back to it as something which is a political awareness, conscience of our time. And this was said in the 60s, so sometimes we take time to understand. It's a long time.
Thank you, Professor Ramadan. Back to Professor Gilroy. In assessing Malcolm X's legacy, some say Brother Malcolm is more importantly viewed as an African-American activist, while others say he's best viewed as a Muslim activist. Certainly the bulk of his public life he spent focused mostly on political issues. He once said at the ballot or the bullet speech, "We should put our religion in the closet." And his public life as a Muslim minister was in the Nation of Islam, whose religious bona fides were debated. So is Malcolm's legacy best understood in terms of politics or religion?
Well, a number of things that Professor Ramadan has already said today help to answer this or respond to this question. You spoke a little while ago of Malcolm's understanding of the relationship between Islam and universality. And I don't like the idea of counterposing African American with Muslim, because you also spoke about the kind of ability to connect things that not just Malcolm's life but his political imagination reveals. So I suppose I want to repeat those points, and then I want to say that, and this is a different kind of a point, it's less a point about Malcolm, that I don't think I accept the distinction between politics and religion, actually, and I think we need to be clear about where the category of religion arises, how it's developed historically, how it relates to the life of anthropological views of the world, comparative views of human social arrangements and so on. And more than that, I think we need to explore the practical association of politics and religion in the institutions of governments and the democratic orders that we inhabit. And, you know, I'm English, I think, and I grew up learning about Henry VIII and his wives at school. And I was always puzzled when I looked at the money, you know, that the Queen was described as the defender of the faith here. So part of my commitment to my country is a particular orientation to the problem of how politics and religion are connected to one another. And I don't think that's unique, actually. I think that the more we study and unpack this question, the more we look at it, different cases, different examples, we will find a convergence there that's fundamental, and we will see that the distinction that's being drawn seems a more contingent, a more arbitrary one, much of the time, than it ought to be. Obviously, in the French world, one thinks of Rousseau, actually, and Rousseau's recipe for democratic political orders, deriving from a secularization of certain features of religion. The notes of the government on the government of Poland, Rousseau saying, the king must get them all to be thinking about patriotism at every moment. And this isn't for everyone. We must have this citizen focused on their place within the national order, you know, with every beat of their heart. So these traditions go deep in the institutions that we're in the academic traditions we're in the governmental and political, the traditions of statecraft. Nowhere is it possible, I would submit, to distinguish absolutely between the order of politics and the order of religion. Now, of course, there are political institutions, there is the formal matter of voting and elections and so on. I'm not talking about it on that level. I'm talking about the broad definition of politics, and I don't see any division that we can find. For me, these two things are the same, and I think, my sometime friend and colleague, the philosopher Simon Critchley, who teaches in New York at the New School, he's just written a book on this very subject that I guess I would pretty much endorse, arguing that this division is a symptom of a deeper problem. It's not something that we can comfortably disassociate.
Thank you very much. So maybe we can just define Islamists as politicians who happen to be Muslims.
Or just politics.
Redefine as opposed to... Professor Ramadan, your father published a newspaper called Muslimun, and he in fact interviewed Malcolm X. I believe. You can verify that. But Malcolm, in an interview with your dad, apparently was critical of the status of women in many Muslim societies. What were Brother Malcolm's critiques of the Muslim world in regards to gender and race? And I think we had discussed this briefly, but could you elaborate a little bit?
Yes. No, that's an important thing. What you are referring to is just when he was coming back from his pilgrimage, he stopped in Geneva and spent times with my father. And it was a very important moment. We understood this through what he said, but also through Dr. Betty Shabazz, his wife, afterward. And what he was saying in this, he sent him 10 questions that were published in the Muslimun afterwards. And this was the last thing that he wrote before being killed. And in one of the questions, when he was asked about what are the priorities and how does he see the Arab world, he was critical on 3 things. The first, and this is something which was important throughout his life, is education is central, and there is a lack of education. But more importantly is the Muslim scholars were not doing the job of educating the people. So this is something that, once again, is something which was said and repeated by many Islamic trends at that time in Egypt, in North African country, is Islam is facing a crisis, and the Muslim majority societies are facing a crisis. And the most important one is not only the political colonialism, is the cultural and intellectual one. That he said, it's not enough to be black with your skin if you are white with your mind. But that's true. We know that some are like this. Yes. That's completely the point. The point is the only way to resist intellectual colonialism and imperialism is education. He was saying that the Arabs are not doing the job. They are not. And they have a responsibility because Islam came in the Arabic language and they have the religion, so they have to do this. The second is exactly this, is women. That if you want to educate a society, if you want to develop, and he is mentioning this, he said, wherever I went, if you look at the situation of women, if they are not educated, you will see that the society is backward. That's not working. So he was stressing on the fact that there will be no future for Arab countries if they are not improving anything which has to do with education of women. And by saying this, he said in another talk that he gave just a few weeks before being killed, the relationship that he found problematic between religion and culture, which we are still struggling with. That there is much more Arab culture in the way we look at Islam, that Islamic principles with which we can liberate the societies. So this was also something which was very important. And what he also said about this is that the Muslims in the West, but also the Arab Muslims, are not doing enough in their relationship with the African countries. So there is something which is Arabs against Western African societies. This connection is not there. And once again, this is why it's so important to assess this, because have we evolved since that time in our relationship? This understanding that, for example, North African countries, at the end of the day, they are African countries, and we are dealing with Africa. So I think we don't get that. We still don't get this. And there is a very deep problem in our education about Islam as going beyond all this, barriers that we have and this lack of understanding. And the last point that he was also mentioning, which is the problem in the Arab world, was the lack of unity, the lack of working together towards a better future. So many... by the way, he was he was hoping that the Arab world will improve, but deeply he was thinking if the African American and the Black American can do something and be connected, this could be at the periphery what is going to help the Arabs to move on. So this is also something which is quite interesting for us today, because very often we think now that it might be that it's through the periphery that things could move in the Arab world, the perception being that Mecca is the center and the Arab world is the center. So it might be that, and this was his intuition at that time, that the Arabs are very far from giving to the Muslim communities around the world what should be done, and the Arab societies are facing crises that are very deep, and one of them, as you said, is women.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Gilroy, our board of directors, and actually we have a couple of members of Malcolm X's family on our board, two of his daughters, Ilyasa and Malak. And, you know, our passions were aroused by the fact that Manning Marable wrote a book. And he said some things that were very troubling. Why does Malcolm X still arouse such political passions, such as the one seen in reactions to Manning Marable's book?
Well, I think the key to this is Malcolm's very special role as an example of a kind of heroic masculinity. And I think there's a special context for that, because you've all seen the civil rights struggles, the photographs of men walking with placards that say, "I am a man." You've seen that. And you've read it, and of course familiar with Ossie Davis standing at Malcolm's grave and saying, "Malcolm was our manhood." So I think that quality of heroic manliness is a very powerful thing that can reverse the sort of child condition, the boyhood, if you like, that was required by slavery and its aftermath. And, you know, in that context, the idea of a manly brand of leadership can effectively compensate the whole of that community for its lack of access to an authentic masculinity. And Malcolm, you know, and this is, I think, part of what disadvantages us in encountering him as a myth, is burdened with that as the incarnation of the primary symbol of African-American manhood, which has placed a heavy, you know, perhaps an unbearable burden on his contested legacies. And the voices that are most keen to identify Malcolm with the restoration of manhood to African Americans in general haven't always been so quick to interpret his story for what it might show us about the questionable political value of brotherhood, or the logic of fratricide, where brothers turn against each other. And they've often mistaken the proper characteristics of relations, not just between men and women, actually, but between generations, between parents and their children. So I think that that's a burden on Malcolm. And I mean, I don't want to take a view of Professor Marable's scholarship. Lots of things are going to be said about Malcolm, and I can understand the family's absolute commitment to trying to protect, with love, Malcolm's reputation and his legacy. But, I mean, if I personally, all I can also say is that if I were to find out tomorrow that Malcolm had had sex with a man at some point, you know, it wouldn't make any difference to anything that I know or think about Malcolm. It makes no difference to anything. And I would also say, and this is a very, you know, maybe this is a difficult thing for some people, I don't know, but I think we also have to be aware of how what is bound up with Malcolm's memory is so important and so potent and so much part of our future, not just of our past, that there are forces in the world that want to disorganize and distract us from engaging with Malcolm's memory. And so I don't want to entertain a debate about that, because there's so much more to know and to think about Malcolm that the issue of this or that book or the books that are yet to be written, I'm not really. We need to know what happened. We need to know what happened, but we shouldn't be disorganized and distracted by trivial questions that need to be placed in the context of this unfair, I think, and unreasonable burden that frames Malcolm's image, his image, as this avatar of authentic African-American masculinity.
Thank you, Professor Gilroy. I met Dr. Betty Shabazz. When I first met her, she said, "And what's your name?" She was very serious. And I said, my name is Zead Ramadan. And she went like this. She melted. It was the first and only time I had ever seen her do that. And she said, are you the son of Zead Ramadan? And I said, the gentleman in Europe. No. And she went like this. She thought I was him. So to answer a question that I'm sure been stirring around your minds, it's just like two Johnsons being in the same room or two Ahmeds being in the same room. We're good friends, but not related. But I say that because many people, including American Malcolm X scholars, are not sure or don't know to what extent your father's friendship had on Malcolm X's evolution, since there were significant changes in his positions on how he viewed his own faith and politics after he returned from his travels. And a couple times had spent some time with your father. Did your father discuss Brother Malcolm's views with you? And what do you recall him saying about what he felt Malcolm needed to think about or change in his politics or religion, or are they interchangeable?
Yes. This is a story which is not really known, and I think it's important as to the substance, not only because of what happened, that he met him when he came back from pilgrimage and they spent time. In fact, it's someone in the States, just after what happened with Elijah Muhammad, who told him, if you go to Saudi Arabia and you're way back, you have to go to Geneva and meet with Dr. Said Ramadan, rahimahullah, and he went and he spent time with him. And what was important even for me, because it had an impact on me, because what my father was telling me about the United States of America had nothing to do with immigrants and Arabs going there. It was all about African American and Malcolm X struggle. And the first thing that I heard, in fact, is something that I realized afterward. When we very often we speak about Malcolm X and at the same time Malik Shabazz. And in between there is this pilgrimage. And then he told him something which I remember my father told me is the Malcolm X, the X, that's the unknown, was put as a reaction to what you did to us. So I don't know where I'm coming from. Malik Shabazz is an identity. I know who I am. So Malcolm X is because what you did to me. Malik Shabazz is what I'm going to do with myself. So the very important point here is the identity factor is how do you define? There is two ways of defining your identity, from within and from outside, to be the object of the perception of the people or the subject of your own decision. And three words that were often there when first, what I heard from my father is that he was in doubt of many things. Something was broken with his past, and what happened with Elijah Muhammad, he was looking for something. And he was broken at the same time, very assertive. Three qualities that were there. It's his courage. First, he was courageous and ready for the struggle. This is what I heard, and this was something which was important. Intelligent in the way that he wanted to understand what was the history of the Muslim resistance and Islamic resistance in Egypt, in the Middle East, and trying to understand this and trying to understand and the connection. So he was very much, and the universality of his own commitment was also important. He was dealing with leftists, he was dealing with Islamists. My father, when he was in the 60s, it was quite clear for all the people who knew him, he was the representative outside of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was resisting to the oppression of Gamal Abdel Nasser. If you are a leftist, Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 60s was a big man. He was resisting the American. So he was starting to be in between. So I say, okay, I take from Gamal Abdel Nasser the fact that he's resisting, and I take from them the fact that they are faithful to the Islamic principles. So you understand that the complexity was there, and what I got is someone who is trying to find his way in all this and trying to listen to everyone, courageous, committed, and as you said, and I think that this is an important point, is humble. It's full of humility. He was going to and coming to listen to people, and also this spiritual dimension. So this is why I really think that when we come back to the message, we understand that this humility factor might be the most important thing that he came to during the last 2 years of his life. Is these are two different people. Malik Shabazz is not exactly Malcolm X. It's not exactly the same. Malcolm X as to struggling for the rights is something. Malik Shabazz is really something which is the spiritual journey is there. There is something here which is the spiritual dimension. There is much more heart with God with Malik Shabazz than it was with Malcolm X. And it has an impact on the message. It has an impact on the message. And this is why it's very important. You know, there is something that we have to talk about, and maybe it's not because we want the message to be universal that we have to forget the Islamic qualification of the message. At the end of the day, Dr. King, he has a universal message, and we all know that he was a Christian and a committed Christian. Why is it that we accept the universal dimension of his message coming as a Christian, and when it comes to Islam, we have to forget that he is a Muslim just to show that he was universal? I think if we are, that's an important point if we want to come back to his legacy and to be able to say both at the same time.
Thank you, Professor Ramadan. We have one more question for each one of the panelists here. But before I go on, this room is filled with about 400 to 500 people, and we thank you all. But there are also 2 other rooms with videos in them, and I just wanted to thank all of those that were on the queue, or that Americans don't know what a queue is. It's the line outside. That's just for the folks in New York. And we just wanted to thank you for understanding and being in the other rooms, and we look forward to your questions after these last 2 questions. And on cue, this question for Professor Gilroy, it's kind of a tough one. A lot of scholars don't like to deal with this question. So there's a small play going around the United States. It's called The Meeting. And it's something that we all think about. That photo may have been one of the only times that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King ever physically met. They corresponded. The Meeting is a hypothetical play about a planned meeting between Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem. And it's just them 2. They debate their approaches to dealing with the issues that they tackle every day, and the audience at the end is left to ponder their similarities, their differences, and their effectiveness. Here's a real tough question, Dr. Gilroy. If Dr. Martin Luther King and Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz were alive today, doing what they do best, and as represented in the last years of their lives, who do you believe would be more relevant and effective today?
Well, it's only neoliberalism that tells us that we are freest when we have to choose. Right. You see? So I'm not going to choose. I don't want to choose, and I don't want to live actually a political life which requires that of me. And I think I'm interested not just in plotting their lives together and seeing them as, as Edward Said would have seen them, as 2 lines of music, where there are harmony notes at certain points in the bars, and then there are dissonant notes and passing notes in the way that the theme is developed and repeated. So I see them as 2 lines of music, and it goes back actually to 2 points that have been made earlier on. I just want to repeat them. One is the question about religion and politics and the convergence of the two things. And more importantly, perhaps most importantly for me, is the question of the human. The question of the human. And how does one enchant or re-enchant, restore to the idea of the human the power that they, in different ways, invested in it. Now, a lot of us don't read Martin Luther King, I must admit. We think that we know who he is from the myth and the image in the same way. We read Malcolm, that's a different kind of engagement. And I think we need, in the same way I said earlier on, we need to understand Malcolm's life as history, not myth. I think the same is true of King too. We need to read him. And so when we, in his writing, in his philosophical writing, I was surprised when I found that he was debating Fanon in those books, for example. When Fanon says, we need to make a new man, we need to find a new understanding of the human that comes from our struggles in this critical time in world history. Martin Luther King says, yes, that's right. But the problem with you, Fanon, is that you think that new man can be a violent man. I think that's a misreading, actually, of Fanon also. But let's not get to that. The point is that in all of these figures, there's an interest in the human and a commitment to rethinking the problem of the human outside of the available specifications and definitions that are associated with unfreedom and injustice. And that's what we want to hold on to. So we don't have to choose. We're not freest when we have that choice.
Thank you, Professor Gilroy. On Martin Luther King Day, my 8-year-old son in his class, in his second grade class, they decided not to study trees. They decided to study nonviolent peacemakers. Mm-hmm. So my son, Tariq Ramadan, this is coincidental. I actually had no idea. I sent an email to my friends and said, hey, we just had a boy and I named him Tariq. And they said, my friend Eric Schermerhorn writes back in an email, wow, he's like one of the most famous Muslims in Europe. I said,
have you got him off the no-fly list yet?
Yeah, but he has a microchip in his passport, so they're not too concerned about him. So they're studying nonviolent peacemakers. And they say to this group of 7 and 8-year-olds, who do you think we should study first on Martin Luther King Day, studying nonviolent peacemakers? And my son raises his hand really quickly and says, Malcolm X. And the teachers balk, and they look at each other. And then they go, anyone else today? And he says, Stephen Biko. And they had no idea what he was talking about. So, given that sort of context, the general unknowing public's perception of Brother Malcolm, is someone who was violent, though we know there was little evidence that he actually ever practiced violence. So about Malcolm, the man, more relevantly to your experience, Professor Ramadan, the guest from America that was in your home. And as a child, I understand you sat on his lap and he played with you. Can you recall anything about how you felt as a child around this powerful figure? What qualities do you remember that books don't capture, and your family remembers about Malcolm? How was he as a guest, as a friend?
I was very, very, very young. What I can say about what I got, once again, because I think that this was part of my childhood and also what I heard from my father and my mother. There's something also which is important, is that the connection was important afterward when he was killed with Dr. Betty Shabazz. She came, they went together to Hajj, and the first Hajj that she made was with the family. And we got a lot from her about the last years and the last struggle and his understanding. The only thing that I really think was important, and this is why I keep on repeating that it's very important as for the message, is it's strange because all what I got from my father about this relationship, and it was short, it was 5 days, and it was then they were writing to each other, calling each other, and it was very deep at the same time. And what I got from this relationship and the tapes that my father had some tapes of his discourse and speeches, and we were listening to this. And at that time, my understanding was very superficial, and sometimes I was not understanding. But it was mainly these three things that were important. First, it was not at all about violence. There was nothing about violence, by the way, at home when we were in this connection. It was all about standing up, being courageous, speaking the truth. Speaking the truth. This was it. He was, and supporting everything which was coming from the black African American standing up, and there is a way. And by the way, my father started to be connected to, when he was to go to the States, he was not going to go to the immigrants with people coming from Egypt. He was going to Harlem and staying with the people who were the followers. So my connection was with these people from a very early age. And mainly this was it. There is a double injustice. In our way, we are not understanding Islam, and in our way, we are accepting racism within the society and within our community. This was something which was important. And then very much understanding this commitment and his humility was also something that I heard a lot. That when he was in Geneva, he was listening a lot and being very humble, trying to get the very understanding of Islam and what it means and how. In fact, he was asking for advice when coming back to the States. What should be my position? What should I do now that I'm not going to? So, and something also which is important that we should never forget, I think, that his relationship with money. He wanted to be completely independent, and he's in the last words he was saying, we have a very small mosque and we are putting our money here. So he was not going, as some are going now, to get the money from the Arab world to do things. He said, I'm coming from, I was born in the ghetto, I am going back to the ghetto, and we are doing things at our level. And I think that this is part of the humility and understanding that there is no liberation process without this. This is all what I got, which was mixed with an impression that someone who was very powerful. And something else which was important, it's clear that when he was in Geneva, after his pilgrimage, going back to the States, he knew that he was going to be killed. And still he didn't give up. And I think that also this is the spiritual message of it. The spiritual message of it is, at the end of the day, we have to struggle, and there is something that is going to happen. They know that I'm more dangerous now because I understand the true Islam. But by the way, this is why it was quite clear that he had no choice. This was what he had to do. And I think that these are things that I kept on listening and hearing at home, and this is what, for me, is the message that I want to come back to, which is based on these very important principles.